are concerned with establishing the fact, they are interested in establishing what actually happened. So what was the manifestation of that behavior? And they can identify these occurrences of discriminatory behavior by understanding what the effects of prejudice are. Okay, the effects of prejudice on the victim of discrimination. And if you can establish in a court of law that this is the effect, this is what happened as a result of what was done to this person, that's what the court needs to know in order to establish it. So what is not necessary is that the court must have a very good understanding of what is the definition of caste, what exactly is it, and so on and so forth. What was in the mind of those, or that's not that important. What's more important is what was actually done. Okay, the action. Okay, so outline what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about prejudice, about identity, about the failure of words, about the contested history of the notion, what was caste, what is caste, what it has become, and the nested forces at play, global, local, legal, community, as well as the silencing of rivalry. Finally, also how eruptions nonetheless happen, even if there is an attempt to silence voices who want to talk about caste. So, the nature of prejudice, you might know, is a text by Gordon Allport. A very old text, but it has recently been republished again. There was a 50th anniversary and lots of new work has been done on it. I would suggest that you should look at it. Those of you who are interested in psychology might be more interested. In the nature of prejudice, toward the end, Allport concludes that law is intended only to control the outward expression of intolerance. But outward action, psychology knows, has an eventual effect upon inner habits of thought and feeling. And for this reason, we must list legislative action as one of the major methods of reducing not only public discrimination, but private prejudice as well. In this context, I hope some of you will enlighten me after the talk about what IIT has done in terms of conforming to what legally it is required to do. I have heard that it has failed to do what it is legally required to do. So please help me after the talk and tell me, okay? I'd like it for record to see in what ways your institution is failing to conform to what is its legal requirements. I'll say a little bit about my view of practical identity. I think practical identities are unstable. I think I need the light. I don't know why it's on. It comes out. Okay. And my practical identities, I think, constrain what is morally possible for me. I need the light because I like to see faces, and now it's all dark. And I can't have a conversation without the light, so somebody should try to get that on. Okay, so any identifiable person, that is a person with a name, is sometimes stigmatized, undergoes changes in personality, in bodily comportment, through aging, through accidents of circumstance, through multifold requirements of practical life, through aesthetic self-fashioning, and through transformative protest. This is one meaning of identity, as I understand it. It's negotiating the continuous process of becoming different. That is what is identity. It's a process of becoming different. And
excuse me?
Caste identity, yes?
Why do you have unstable name?
Pardon?
What did unstable mean in this slide?
What is unstable mean?
In the last slide.
Yeah, it's unstable because it is reliant on circumstances and conditions. It's not entirely up to you. If your conditions radically change, then you may not be in a position to carry on the process in the way, the negotiation the way you want to do it. Okay? So we have the example of Rohit Vemula. Remember that. It's not something that you would expect a person of that caliber, that activism, that understanding to have done if it wasn't for the circumstances which led into it. So instability to that extent that you might have to even end your life. Yeah? That in that sense it is unstable. Okay? Okay. So caste identity I see therefore is a lived practical identity. It is negotiated too. So as I understand it, my practical identity is a disjunction of roles. I'm either this or that or that or that. I'm a teacher or a mother or Indian or several different things. And normally there would be some kind of an ordered constellation. One thing matters more to me than something else. But each of these roles, they might be radically questioned at different times. Circumstances might lead me to question one particular role. But I don't think that you can sidestep all of these roles altogether. There must be some place from which, some situation, some location from which you think of yourself as a person that you are. So practical identities cannot be given up altogether, because in becoming a person, one's life is embedded in non-governed interpersonal relations, which are both institutional as well as non-institutional. So again, to the extent that institutional relations depend upon power structures which are sometimes completely beyond my control, right? So my practical identities are sometimes forced on me, sometimes I wish to get out of them and I cannot get out of them, at other times I may be forced to give them up. Okay? Now we are talking for this is a talk for the Ambedkar Studies Circle, and I thought it apt to say something right at the beginning about the inspiration that I draw from the Ambedkar. Baba Sahib, as we all formally like to refer to him. Ambedkar's engagement with untouchability as a researcher, an intellectual and activist is much more nuanced, hesitant but intimate as compared to his viewpoint on caste, when he is prepared to offer stronger judgments and preferred solutions. However, with untouchability, there is often a failure of verbs, grief, discourage, and anger. This is how Valerian Rodriguez, who you would know, has described Ambedkar's personal relation to the question of caste and untouchability. Whilst it's possible to think about scholastically about theories of caste, delve into anthropology, social anthropology, philosophy of religion, and so on, as he does, when it comes to the question of untouchability, where he himself has suffered the treatment down to him, there is anger and grief. And I think it's important to remember this emotive element of when we talk about caste, how it affects people differently. It's not the same for everyone. Even though we all may be a part of more or less a similar system, it affects us all differently depending upon our location in our system. Jeffrey Lord also further describes that Ambedkar, the statement and the man of action, has often concealed Ambedkar, the reflective thinker, which is unfortunate because many of his publications are those of a true intellectual. Ambedkar exercised his talent as a sociologist in the service of a cause. He scrutinized the mechanism of caste with the aim of annihilating this social system based on hierarchy. I certainly take my inspiration for doing social political philosophy from him in this way. I personally don't think there's any point in doing philosophy if what you're doing is not eventually guided by some or the other practical intent. I really think that you need to be able to change some aspect of your situation, our situation, if you're going to think critically. If you're in the business of doing philosophy for no reason at all, except playing some mind games, that's not my kind of philosophy. So I definitely derive from inspiration from Ambedkar on this question of our attitude to reflective thinking, critical thinking. In Ambedkar's words, caste is an enclosed class. It's not a physical object, and what he really said is we have to hold on to the idea that caste is a notion, it is a state of mind. And finally, that endogamy is the only characteristic of caste. Does anyone here know what is endogamy? Okay. Can someone who knows what is endogamy say what it is? Yes.
So in endogamy, one marries within one's caste group only, from what I recall.
Yes. Is that okay?
The caste marriage is a common.
It's a bit more complicated than that, but roughly exactly that there is a range of people within whom you can marry, and you can't marry outside that range of people. That range of people can't be too near, can't be too far. Okay, so that's the marriage in group, but not too close. Okay, there is that restriction also of not marrying the same group. us, recent book is quite good in describing to us in detail about where that comes from. And this Portuguese word casta predates the English word caste by more than 2 centuries. So somewhere in the 15th century, casta was around, and then about 17th century, etc. We talked about the English word caste. And collectively, it's supposed to be a collective noun that referred to a pure bloodline or species. So it's definitely racious in origin. The word caste is racious in origin. In the Indian caste system, pollution was more a concern of contamination by impure food or touch rather than by mixing of blood. Okay, so although we see, as Ambedkar says, that endogamy is a characteristic, so mixing of blood does become extremely important and restricted. But initially, what we have when the Portuguese come to India is this groups which already have restrictions on who you can touch upon and who you can eat food with and who you can't eat food with. So what did the Portuguese find in India? The Portuguese and later colonial administrators encountered what Buha calls bounded groups or jatis. They found it expedient to manage these groups for the extraction of labor, for tax revenue, and for recruitment in the British Army. And the interesting thing about the last one, recruitment in British Army, is that it actually encouraged people sometimes to state they were of a particular caste in order to get a job in the army. There was an interesting documentary of the BBC by a journalist called Meeta Dhandha, and she found that her ancestors, her grandfather, great-grandfather, grandfather was of the Thankar caste. But in order to get a job in the British Army, he declared himself as Jat, so that he could get, because Jats was supposed to be the martial race he could get. So those sorts of transitions would have happened, historically. The people that wanted to fit in into recruitment, get recruitment. And I think there is a parallel here now as well, that why it would be important for someone to have or not have a label, if there is attached to it the potential for being a part of a market. Okay, so invoking caste ideals, it mattered not only to colonial administrators, it also mattered to self-made diners. And so caste was like a strategic asset for self-advancement. So under the Mughal, somebody wanted to be taken as a Rajput, perhaps because that would get them ahead under a particular government. So caste labels have been used strategically in the past, and one can say to some extent now too. So casta was deployed in various inventive ways by Iberian, is part of the Spanish group of cases. Iberian intelligentsia in Asia. Sometimes it is evident that they displace their own prejudices onto Asians. Okay, so they have a racial notion of casta, and this is what they impose on the continent that they come to rule. Okay, so the question arises, is caste an imposition? We started talking about the history of caste because it's been said that this is not Indian, this is a traversity of what is Indian. So we want to ask, is it Indian, is it an imposition? So this chronological aspect of caste, casta, is used by some commentators to query the usefulness of this term, because the Indic formations are referred to by other terms. So there's Jati, there's Kaum, there's Kabila, and Zat, distinct historical literature. But I think that in my view, this is failing to appreciate the very complex ways in which tradition and modernity, they intersect and renew caste in various guises. So the boundaries between groups are maintained. They may be redefined, maybe the edges are a bit different, but the boundaries do remain. As Aloysius, who I've only just started reading really, explains this mixing of tradition and modernity, to argue that there is this expanding and intensified movement of what he calls culture-specific social fascism of the subcontinent. Very strong word, but I think we need to think about this. Now to talk about what I have done some work on caste in the context of UK. The very early migrants to the UK were mainly Goan seafarers first, and then sick soldiers in World War I, and then in 1920s there were some peddlers, merchants, batras they're called. But majority of people who went to the UK went to fill labour shortages in 1950s and 60s. Now just the thing about that time is that there was shared housing, and people celebrated festivities and so on together. So when people look back to the 50s and 60s, they will say, oh, you know, there was, whether you are a Jat or whether you are a Chamar or whether you are, I'm going to use this term as a sociologist, so I know in India there is a thing about, but this is reported speech, so you have to, I hope there won't be objection to my using this term, the capital C. Okay. And so there is evidence that people shared houses and they lived together, but gradually this began to change. As more and more Asians came to UK, we have segregation. Not only segregation in living quarters and so on, but segregation in villages, in gurdwaras, in temples and so on. So early migrants were mostly from Punjab, from the Doaba region, and the percentage of scheduled caste migrants is roughly taken to be about 10%, and there are significant differences between Punjabi and Gujarati migrants. Gujaratis are not as stigmatized as Punjabi, Bangladeshi and other aspects, for example, in the UK context. And researching on caste and migration with my B.Tech research fellowship thing, which was actually 2012, 10-12, not 13-14, when I was introduced, we find that there were long-established social religious organizations for Dalit Punjabis. The way that people came was with the help of informal networks, chain migration. So one family member comes, helps a friend, somebody else from the village. And in this chain migration, sometimes it did happen that a Jat who has migrated might help someone who is from a scheduled caste also to come. So that it wasn't completely along caste lines that this migration took place. But it changed in the course of the period as more and more people came. So how did the emergence of caste migration happen? If you look at the early, I've spoken to some Indian Workers Association members, left-wing parties, very, very old, established in UK, that anti-casteism was never an explicit agenda for them. It's only very recently, I know that maybe the last year or so they've started celebrating Ambedkar Jayanti, but it wasn't so much an aspect of what they routinely did. What really happened was that as erstwhile so-called lower caste Punjabis gained in economic clout, there was an eruption of caste prejudice against them. It wasn't acceptable to the so-called upper caste that there should be a low caste person who's got a Rolls Royce. I actually interviewed a guy with a Rolls Royce, and so another guy who said, my main aim is that my son should own a Ferrari. If my son owns a Ferrari, nobody dare treat him badly. Now this is unfortunate that for a lot of people, money is, or wealth is seen as the way out of this prejudice. But underlying it is also still an insecurity, but it won't actually do it. So there is like a double speak happening. You know, they're saying that I want my son to own a Ferrari, but knowing full well that even owning the Ferrari is not going to make a difference. That's what one gets in responses from my Dalit respondents. Okay, I'm going to have to rush too fast. So if you look at Dalit history in the UK, there is presence of Dalits in UK from 1950s. There are examples of things that have happened. So in 1976, a Bedford shopkeeper with casteist views was boycotted, yeah, and he was forced to move. And in the 1970s, everyone mingled, but nobody really thought about caste. But nowadays, everyone's aware of it, and it's getting as bad as back home in India. That's what some people say. Bodh Vihar was opened in April 1991, and Ambedkar centenary celebrations, the ex-PM VP Singh's visit to Wolverhampton, about 300 people converted to Buddhism. It wasn't much reported, but that's what happened. And through the 2000s, awareness of caste issues has remained hidden. Before this whole business of legislation started to take place in UK in 2013, there has been some awareness raising, some newspaper articles. I've mentioned these two. Arun Kumar, who is from Ambedkar Memorial Society in Bedford, and Harpan Smriti, they've written about it. Now, caste in relation to religious practice is interesting because that is where it comes out really in the open, especially when it comes to Sikh Gurdwaras. So in Sikh Gurdwaras, there's tension because management committees seem to come from only so-called upper caste. And there is repeated claims that people who are supposed to be from the so-called lower caste are not allowed to hold any position of power. Regarding Valmikis in Coventry, there are worse accusations that Jats were among the most reluctant to allow them to use cooking utensils in the langar. This was Eleanor Nesbitt's research in 1994. And you might say that things by now, this is 20 years ago, and things by now might have changed. But actually, there are routine skirmishes which happen even now between different elements of Gurdwara management on the question of who is going to manage Gurdwaras, particularly the ones where Ravidasias have staked a claim to be in the management committee. So that routinely happens. And there are cases also of intercaste marriages being stopped. Okay, there are many, not one. There are many cases of intercaste marriages being stopped. And so in the religious domain, casteism takes a particular force, where then people hide behind the fact that Sikhism is really about equality in order to deny that they are casteist. Okay, so in practical life there is casteism, but there's a denial that there is casteism. There's also caste-based discrimination in the workplace. There's this example of a care worker who refused to bathe a woman because she found that there is a picture of Guru Ravidas in her bedroom, and so made out that she's from so-called lower caste and refused to provide the service which she's supposed to as a social worker. I came across a Valmiki post office supervisor who didn't get what he should get from a subordinate, that she refused to obey his orders because she said that she was a lower caste person and she was not going to be ordered around by him. And they called somebody to settle the matter, and an expert on caste. And that expert on caste says that yes, it is the case that he is of the lower caste and she is of the higher caste, and the matter is accepted. So it's accepted as a part of the Indian tradition. That it happens in the tradition is allowed it. So if she doesn't accept his orders, it's a part of what he should accept.
Was it in India?
Pardon?
Was this in India?
No, this is all UK. Yeah. So there was a demand in 2000 that laws which address caste discrimination, address discrimination based on racism should also take account of casteism. So casteism should be treated at par with racism. This is Satpal Woman, who is the chair of Caste Watch UK, and he spoke this at the Voice of Dalit International Conference in 2000. Okay, there's a whole list of details about various organizations that are active, but I'll rush through this. So there's Dalit Solidarity Network, Voice of Dalit International. There was a conference in 2000, as I mentioned, calling for caste to be made an aspect of race. The International Dalit Solidarity Network was set in 2000, Caste Watch UK in 2004, Alliance Against Caste Discrimination 2008, and they have produced very good reports listing incidents of caste discrimination, caste prejudice, humiliation, etc. And these reports are are taken by those who don't want to accept them as non-academic. They want to say this is not systematic, scientific, qualitative research. You're not really following the methods of scientific research. So they refuse to believe what these reports tell them by taking recourse to some high-flown notion about scientific research, right? These are not done by academics. Whereas even that is incorrect, because some of these reports did have academics involved in the groups that conducted them. It's just that they were published under the name of these campaign organizations. In 2005 to 9, Labour government had announced its intention to bring the New Equality Act, but it did not at that stage add caste to the Equality Bill. There was a lot of activism then. And Hindu Council has attempted in this case to incorporate Valmiki voice. And then of course the Valmikis resisted, and they wrote to say that what has been stated as their point of view is not their point of view. Their voice is being misappropriated. So it was being suggested that Dalits are alongside or with the Hindus in opposing legislation, when in fact they were not. So this was challenged. There was an attempt was made to stop their voice by the government. So changes began, and they were stymied, they were stopped. So in 2010, the Equality Act, this section 95A, there was a discretionary power to add caste as an aspect of race in the future. That it said that the ministers may add caste as an aspect of race, but then in April 2013, that's where the big change happened. The Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, Section 97, said that caste must be added to race in the Equality Act. And this is expected via secondary legislation. There is a power to review, which can happen in 5 years' time, and this is referred to as a sunset clause. So this is what it looked like. The Equality Act 2010, Section 9. So if you see on the top there is, what the House of Lords, in the House of Lords was suggested was that you should add caste under the definition of race. That wasn't accepted. What was accepted was that the ministers of the Crown must by may, first it was must may by order, so must by order amend this section to provide caste as an aspect of race. So from the power it became a duty. Now, actually, in the UK Parliament, it is the duty of ministers to write the secondary legislation, which will come back to Parliament, be discussed, and then caste will become an aspect of race. But right now where we are, it is stopped there. Because this secondary legislation can only be done, brought back to Parliament if there is a public consultation first. So in between was this project by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which I led. In that project, we explained what would be the effect of making caste an aspect of race, both the legal review, plus we had an experts and stakeholders seminar, which I'll tell you about in a bit, and following that, the Government Equalities Office was supposed to initiate a consultation. This was before the last election, before the Conservatives came to power. And since they came to power, there was a lot of campaigning from Asian groups, Sikhs as well as Hindus, saying that you should only vote that government in which will not bring caste in. Okay, so they voted for Conservatives in order that caste is not big. This was a major plank in the South Asian community of getting votes for the Conservatives, that you should not bring caste in the legislation. That's the example, the campaign photos with Jeremy Corbyn, some of you might recognize, who's one of the important supporters. Some of the main findings of our Equality and Human Rights Commission reports were that caste has an associational value. It has that value both for so-called upper caste and lower caste. It is across all religions. There's a very complicated relation between caste and religion, as I've just mentioned about the Sikhs. It's not necessarily declining. There are new cases which emerge. So there are cases of Nepali Gurkhas, for example, coming in seeking rental. If somebody finds out they are of the low caste, they're thrown out. There are examples of in places of worship, name calling happening, again within gurdwaras, and there's also exploitation of cheap labor, there's violence against women, and there's all sorts of other denial of service. So in a taxi, if you're going in a taxi and you find out that the person sitting in your taxi driver, in your taxi are of a low caste, for some reason or another stopping the taxi and telling them to get out. This came up in the, one of the examples came in our stakeholders seminar. Okay, so this is just a photo of the event we had, the stakeholders event. We invited people who are opposed to the legislation, people who are supporters, and those who have to implement it. It was quite well attended, about 43 different attendees, and we asked for statements in advance. About 26 people sent their statements, organizations sent their statements. They're all reported, published on the Equality and Human Rights Commission website. You can have a look at it. Now, the whole process of organizing this debate was very, very interesting for us, because what we were trying to do was to make it inclusive, to make it transparent, to make sure that there is a balance of views. But from the start, as leading this project, I was faced with a barrage of questions from the day one. And if I send an invitation letter to someone, I would say, why are you inviting this organization, not that organization? Or there were all sorts of this, oh, you can't hold it just near Diwali, it was supposed to be 3rd November, we had to change the date to some other because so that it doesn't clash with it. And there were lengthy conversations, sometimes more than an hour-long conversations I had with various organizations, British Du Bois, or so on and so forth. Lots of different people, lots of different organizations who challenged our neutrality. You know, I had already written about the fact that I support the legislation. So it was a question of holding an event where we can have a conversation across completely opposite point of view while still holding my view. And I was open to getting, views from the other side and reporting them accurately. And so there was one, I've given this example, one official who said, I'll be upfront with you, we are suspicious of you, we have seen your profile, you have done a lot of work on untouchability, you must have a position. So I said, of course I have a position. You know, I do support the legislation, but what exactly should be the content of the second legislation? I have no idea. That's why I think we need to sit together. And so there were complaints about non-objectivity, and I think that's a question we have to think about. When we are committed to an idea of change, and we want other people who do not agree with us to sit down and have a conversation with us, how can we do it honestly? Can we do it? I believe we can do it honestly. We can start from opposite ends of a spectrum and still have a conversation about where we're going with it. Because we have to accept that either of us may be wrong in at least expressing our difference, if nothing else. You know, I think that my difference is X, but actually it isn't X. Through conversation I find out that our difference of view is Y, something else. And I think that you have to be open about. You might still end up being different, but you might be wrong in the manner in which you have expressed your difference with someone else. Okay, so conversation always helps, in my view, to getting clearer both about the strength of your own position as well as where exactly the difference lies. Right? So I'm not saying dialogue solves all problems. Dialogue doesn't solve all problems, but it gives clarity which is necessary. So as a result of the stakeholders workshop, the interesting thing was that there were again very diametrically opposite views. So the pro-legislation view was that caste is linked to Hindu scriptures. And the other side said that association of caste with Hinduism is deplorable. So one side says there is no occupation association, we accept. Okay, so in UK we are able to do what we want to do. Nobody is going to say that your prospect of occupation is tied to your caste. It's not. But endogamy persists, and social exclusion persists, and discrimination also persists. This is the pro-legislation view. On the other side was a view that negative treatment is unlikely. Okay, and if it seems to happen, it is unprovable. You can't show it. The unprovable part, I think, is a problem. Very often, you cannot show that something has occurred, that discrimination has occurred, even though you know that it has occurred. Similarly, the view of the pro-legislation organizations was that the law, if it comes in, will empower people. It will deter others from acting in a discriminatory fashion. And those who thought that legislation should come in considered it, actually called it malicious. And this was the key thing they said, that it will increase awareness of a dying institution. They argued that if you let it alone, it's just going to die. And by mentioning caste in the legislation, you're actually giving fire to it, you're increasing. Now that's something we can discuss later if you want to. It also, they said, threatens integration and it is unnecessary. Now I think at least the threatens integration and having mentioning caste in legislation, it gives fuel to a dying institution. Those are arguments that you hear in India as well. And I think it's important to know how to respond to those arguments if you are for legislation for anti-casteism.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
have made an argument from one side, legislative views, and other people who have made an argument from the other side.
Yeah.
So I don't think these two categories, anti-legislation versus pro-legislation, represent two different categories of people as such.
So I didn't get your.
So there may be people who may have supported the first point in the pro-legislation.
Yeah.
And the same people may have supported the third point in the anti-legislation as well.
Which particular one? Oh, you mean they're not necessarily, all of those things don't necessarily consistently held by one group? Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. But I mean, it'd be interesting to see which ones you have in mind. Maybe, yeah, it's possible that someone might not believe that association of caste with Hinduism is deplorable. They might accept that historically it is a part of, Hinduism, but they still think that it is a sort of time institution, and they still think that it's a tradition. That's possible. You did have a liberal centrist views where people will accept something as a part of past, of things that happened, but now they think that it shouldn't be done in a way. Yeah, I agree with you, but the way I have posed it, it's just for simplicity that people will use that or there. Okay. So similarly, in terms of the response, we got very good response from those who were for legislation that we are campaigning for 40 years, and we give them satisfaction that finally it's recognized. And then, on the other side, the Alliance of Hindu Organization wrote to the all-party parliamentary group for Hindus, and the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for this, that this is an act of anti-Hindu racial and religious violence and prejudice of the highest order. So they accused the work that was done as a part of the HRC as an act of anti-Hindu, or trying to include caste equality acts as an act of anti-Hindu racial violence. This is interesting because it's actually appropriating the language of human rights to talk against an attempt to protect the rights of some people. So that is trying to protect their own rights. And the other side is using the language of human rights to stop them from doing it.
How is it the language of human rights?
Pardon?
How is it the language of human rights?
Because it is talking about, it is anti-Hindu racial and religious violence. They are saying that Hindus are being attacked. Our Hindus are being attacked. Our right to follow our religion is being threatened. So it's talking the language of human rights really, our right to religious worship or whatever. If that is being threatened in this whole business. That's been one of their criticisms. So sometimes it puts the organizations who are campaigning, like Aswatik and others, a little bit on the back foot, and they have to be very careful how they word their demands. Yeah, whatever the kind of slogans you hear in this country, anti this, that or the other, are not really what you would be able to argue. Nothing. You're only able to argue protect us without actually saying protect us because X, Y, Z is, people are. You don't want to say that. You just want to say protect us. Okay? But in this whole process, the allies also between themselves change their negotiations. So there is a parallel process happening. There's a consolidation of Hindu diaspora identity taking place, but at the same time, there's kind of unraveling of the Sikh diaspora identity. The Sikhs are supposed to be doctrinally for equality against casteism. But amongst the Sikhs, there are some who would want to say that just associating the possibility of casteism with Sikhism itself is anti-Sikh. So they don't want to have anything to do with the legislation. It's like saying we shouldn't be accused because we can't possibly be casteist, which is completely false. And there are amongst the Sikhs, there are Dalits who are saying that let's not bury our head in the sand. There is a problem that we have, and now what that does is there is a rupture in the Sikh identity. So there are Sikhs who are on one side who want to support the legislation, and there are others who want to oppose the legislation. The ones who want to oppose the legislation really get closer to the organization. Some exactly are very much closer, very close to the organization. Some go to the extent of even thinking that Sikhism, Jainism, etc., they are all acronyms. So you have that extreme as well, which is in the diaspora. Some that I don't want to name who, or maybe know, but avoiding mentioning names of people here. there's continuous pressure to scrap the legislation. This is quite a few months ago, but it comes up again and again. This is emailed to me by the Anti-Caste Legislation Committee, which was set up, and they are taking the lead in fighting against getting this caste legislation in. And their main plank is also, this is Christian propaganda. Because one of the peoples who is in the forefront is Lord Bishop Harris, the Bishop of Oxford, and he is quite a campaigner for getting caste included in the Equality Act. And what's being said is that this whole business happening in UK is because in India there is the need to have Christians, reservations among Christians, and that is why this is happening. I don't quite follow their logic, but that is what they are claiming, that this is all a concoction to talk about caste discrimination in order to get the reservations for Christians in India. Now, just as a background, I don't know if you know this already, but I thought you might. So, this resistance to legislation on caste discrimination in the UK is happening in a world where we have got caste as a ground for non-discrimination in the constitution of all these states. It's included in Bangladesh, in India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. It's not included in Bhutan and Maldives. Likewise, it's included in Burkina Faso, Mauritius, and federal states of Micronesia, but it's not included where you would expect, where there's a lot of Asian population in Canada and Fiji and South Africa. Yeah, so it's odd. I mean, the places where you would think that it should be there, it's not, even though there are populations who are. Now, there's I don't think I'll be able to show you this video because we're also running short of time. But there's a famous case, I'll ask you to look it up yourself, which is Turkey versus Chundok. There was, Turkey versus Chundok, which had a favorable judgment for Miss Turkey, who's an Adivasi woman who was in the employment of the Chundoks, and the court awarded her £184,000 in lost wages because she was mistreated for years by her employers, paid less, made to work like a slave. I attended that case in court, and was in touch with Chris Wilson, the lawyer, before the final judgment happened. Okay, so the government stance has been that the government has no immediate plans to incorporate caste into legislation, and they are now waiting for the judgment of Turkey. They think that because Miss Turkey was able to win the case with the existing law, we don't need to change it, we don't need to add caste. It's already covered under ethnic origins in the existing legislation, so that's what they are arguing. Now, but I think that what Turkey actually showed was that discrimination is normalized, and therefore it is hidden. But what happened in court was that it had to be established on patterns of behavior of prejudice had to be established. That's what the lawyers tried to do. They tried to show how long did Miss Turkey have to rest, was she allowed to go in and out, all of that. And that was enough. Just the patterns of behavior which anyone could agree were discriminatory, were not in keeping with what is appropriate behavior towards another human being. That was enough for the judge to rule that discrimination has taken place. Okay, so it doesn't matter about what definition you give. That was what was necessary. Now, what we are arguing is that if you actually added caste to the legislation, it would give legal certainty. Right now there is this evidence of this case law, but it can be overturned by a future case until it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. So we are saying if you add caste to the legislation, it will give legal certainty. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So the various opposition to the legislation, there's legal and policy arguments, there is no evidence of a problem, and this is made by parliamentarians. We shouldn't proliferate the grounds of discrimination, so there are many different grounds. It can be on sex, on race, on sexual preference, age, etc., etc. So the parliamentarians would argue that you shouldn't just add another one, it's just too much to handle. And this sort of argument has been given against all protected characters. Wherever you want to add a new one, there will be arguments against it. Okay, so there will be unjustified burden on business, that's also been argued. And there should be education, not legislation. That's been also argued by community groups as well as government. There are ideological arguments. I've already mentioned that caste is a colonial construct. But what we argue is that pre-colonial opposition to caste, even though it was only the religion therefore there was opposition. So we don't need to do too much of digging up history to know that. Okay, so only if you have read your Ravidas and Kabir, you know that there was a problem of caste, right? So even then there's the argument, if we can't define caste, how can we legislate against discrimination on the grounds of caste? And my response to that is, again, we only require to identify patterns of discriminatory conduct, even if the discriminatory conduct itself is motivated by some muddled concept. It doesn't matter what concept of caste you have, it might be thoroughly muddled. But if your behavior is objectionable, that's all we are interested in, not what you think about it. Right? Again, I'm trying to put a distance between what's in your mind and what you actually do.